Let's welcome our next speaker, Professor Maggie Lawrence. So Maggie is Professor in the Department of Nursing and Community Health at the Glasgow Caledonian University. Tonight, she will be telling us about her journey as a researcher and about Heads Up, her current project on mindfulness to support mental health after stroke. So please welcome Maggie.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you to the Stroke Association for organising tonight and giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the Heads Up programme of research that I've been leading for a few years now. Heads Up, I'll explain a bit more later, but it stands for Helping Ease Anxiety and Depression After Stroke. I'm going to talk briefly for the next few minutes about my research journey and how important funding from organisations such as the Stroke Association has been to making that career happen. I'll briefly have a revisit. We've already heard about the impacts of stroke from Jason and from Mark, but I'll talk about that briefly and then spend a lot of time focusing on the Heads Up project and in particular letting you hear from the people who took part in that research. So my journey in stroke research, actually I realise now began a step before this. I did a funded PhD study that was funded by the Chief Scientist Office in Scotland. And that was about young adults who had a stroke. And one of the big findings from that study was that young adults were afraid of having another stroke, as Jason has alluded to. And there was also this big issue around the anniversary of stroke and the fear being particularly strong then. But young adults also frequently wanted to know how to not have another stroke if they could. What could they do? And they knew that they needed to maybe change lifestyle, so maybe to be more physically active or to drink less alcohol or whatever. But they didn't necessarily know how best to go about that. And if they did, they didn't always find it very easy. So off the back of that PhD work, I then applied for a Stroke Association Senior Research Training Fellowship. And the intention of that was to develop a family-centred intervention that would help people of all ages to make healthy changes after a stroke. And the outcome of that work was actually a module on a website called Self-Help for Stroke, which is a bit similar to the My Stroke Guide that you'll probably be familiar with that the Stroke Association produced. So there's a module on there called Keeping Well, which is about healthy lifestyles. But we also realised that if people are going to make changes like that, that they maybe have been doing things like drinking too much alcohol, or if you're me, eating too many donuts when you're stressed. So what do we do to help people not do that? We can't just say to them, you need to stop eating donuts, you need to stop drinking alcohol, it's not good for you. We need to help them find other ways of coping with stress and anxiety and the stresses of daily life. So with that learning, I then went on to think about mindfulness as a potential thing that people could do that didn't cost much money once you'd learnt it, that you could do anywhere. You didn't need a gym membership, you didn't need expensive equipment. It was just something that you could learn to do and maybe draw on whenever you needed it. So we had funding again, this time from the Chief Scientist Office, and that was for development research. So we took a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction programme and we adapted it to make it more accessible for people who'd had a stroke. And then once we'd done the development work, and during that study we worked with people who'd had a stroke and with family members of people who'd had a stroke, we then applied to the Stroke Association, who had a priority call out for psychological research following stroke. And we wanted to test the course that we had now developed to see whether or not people liked it, could they do it, did they stick with the 9 weeks, and very importantly, were they able to keep practicing mindfulness when the course had finished. So during all those funded projects, these were keeping me in a job, if you like. They were helping me develop as a researcher, and they were helping me be promoted and continue to raise awareness and continue to work in the field of stroke research. So all of those funding pots were really fundamental to what I was doing and to hopefully the outcomes that we've seen improving things for some people who've had a stroke. Mark's already mentioned this, and it was certainly Jason's experience, is that stroke comes out of the blue. People don't expect it. They tend not to have very obvious warnings of it coming on, and it can have quite devastating and immediate impacts. We've heard from our previous speakers as well that having a stroke can impact the relationships that you have with other people. And from Stroke Association surveys, we've learned that almost half of the people who have a stroke probably experience a disruption in their relationship with their family members, like their spouse or a partner. And 1 in 4 people will talk about these kind of negative impacts on their wider family and social networks. Jason interestingly mentioned this issue around employment, and there's a lot of data that tells us people don't go back to work after stroke for lots of reasons, or if they were unemployed, then they tend not to become employed after stroke. And the same applies to education. If we look more widely at the cost to society, estimates are that it can cost £26 billion a year, and this includes things like lost tax income revenue from people not being employed, and the actual health and social care costs. So we know there's a big problem after stroke around mood disorder, as we call it, so particularly anxiety and depression. But we also know that services are patchy and that not everybody has access to the service they need at the time they need it, or possibly for long enough. So out of this kind of background came the idea for Heads Up. So Heads Up, as I've said, stands for Helping Ease Anxiety and Depression After Stroke. It's based on a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is a structured course that lasts for 8 or 9 weeks and requires people to practice the skills that they learn on that course, as you would with any course that you were learning skills on, and to continue practicing that in the long term. This was developed way back in the 80s by John Kabat-Zinn and has been widely researched, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's effective for lots of conditions and for lots of different types of people. So there was no reason to think that it wouldn't be effective in stroke, but what we did want to do was to make sure that it was more accessible for people. So as I've already mentioned, there was a sort of program of work. There was the development work in which we worked with people affected by stroke, where we made the changes to make the Heads Up course, well, to develop the actual Heads Up course and to make the materials more accessible. We then took on the work that we'd just finished, which was in 2 parts and was funded by the Stroke Association. So in the first part, we asked groups of people to do a mindfulness course, to do Heads Up, and then to tell us what they thought about it in focus groups and questionnaires afterwards. So we did that face-to-face, and then COVID happened, so we had to do it all again online, because the next stage was for us to test it in different groups of people and with bigger numbers. So 62 people took part in an online research project. A randomized controlled trial essentially means that all our participants were randomly split into 2 groups, and one of the groups would get Heads Up and the other group didn't. And everybody was asked to do questionnaires throughout the study and to take part in focus groups to tell us about their experiences. So that work has literally just come to an end, and we are just writing up and reporting that. And these are the people that I've worked with to do this research. So Dr. Bridget Davis, I've been working with her since 2017, and she's now Senior Research Fellow and was Project Manager for the Heads Up randomized controlled trial. Naomi Clark was the researcher on that project. She has a psychology background, and she's now gone on to do her PhD looking at what can we do to support people's practice in the long term once they've finished a mindfulness course. Matilda Pieri is a speech and language therapist from Italy. She's undertaking a PhD that's also funded by the Stroke Association by our project grant, and she's looking at making Heads Up even more accessible, if you like. She's looking at adapting the material for people who have aphasia, who, as Mark said, are quite often a group that are ignored in stroke research. And then Leila Diamicis worked with us on the development work, and she also has a background in psychology. So you can see not only has the money from the Stroke Association benefited my career journey, but it's also supporting 2 early career researchers at the start of their journeys. And Bridget is continuing to work in stroke research as well. Here are the people that we work with. We work with people who've had a stroke and with family members of people who've had a stroke in a range of capacities over the years. So some have acted as advisors, some have taken part in a panel of experts, for example. Many people have taken part as participants over the years, and some people are also members of our applicant group for further funding. And in the last stage of the research, people have also been overseers of the quality of the research that we've been carrying out. So now, hopefully, it's time to hear from the people who've taken part in the research. No, that didn't happen. Here we go.
So in the feasibility study, we're really looking to ask the people who take part in the course, which is part of a research project, we're asking them to tell us what they thought about the actual course, so what they thought about Heads Up, but we also need to know what they thought about the research process. So the things we were asking them to do, which was like fill out questionnaires about their mental health, and to take part in things like the focus group we've had today.
The whole team are very easy to talk to. Bridget works like a Trojan. So we decided, phoned up one of the people in the college. We had a screening process and we decided we'd give it a bash to see how it would be. Bridget came out and interviewed me, and then we did what was known as questionnaires, which I answered as best I could.
So the learning that we have from these things will then help us to maybe make changes to the design of the pilot study which comes next autumn.
They just always get time for you. You could ask them anything. They make it easy to come here, and that's a huge thing for somebody who's had a stroke.
And there's always somebody there, and they've always got a word. You're welcomed when you come. They sit with you at tea break and all the rest of it, and you always get a fond farewell. A good greeting and a fond farewell.
So that's a little insight into what it's like for people who've had a stroke to actually be involved in a research project. And these are some of the people who took part in the first the face-to-face version of Heads Up that we did. So as well as telling us about what it was like to actually take part in the research, they've also reflected on the impact of doing the course on them and on their families.
I actually think I'm a different person now. I think my husband will vouch for that too. I don't go on to him as much, but I feel more relaxed with having done it. And you know, if you get sort of uptight, you can just calm yourself down with your breathing.
So yeah, I do have my anxious moments, but I feel I can actually deal with them. And if it hadn't been for mindfulness, I'd have been swimming against the tide. And I swam against the tide for a good, that's what, eight and a half months until I got to this course.
This is going to be the tool set that I'll use for both myself and for Anne for the rest of our life. Whenever we think there's going to be any event or any anxiety or stress, I now have this tool set that I can use and say, this will help me manage and control any anxiety or stress.
And I can honestly say after the 9 weeks, it has just changed me as a person, which I didn't think was possible. It's given me some belief in myself back again, and some confidence.
Okay, so finally, we did ask these same participants if they would make videos that we could use to recruit to future studies. So this clip here is specifically about that. It's about talking to people who might be interested in taking part in research but are not quite sure. So let's give this a try. No? Yeah.
You're going to be wary. You're
going to have that panic moment. I'm going in amongst all these people. What's it going to be like? Well, am I going to talk to people? Am I going to be sat there and just listen and be a dummy? And it ends up, you're there for 9 weeks. And by the 3rd week, I started to get what it was about.
Any apprehensions that I had at the start of it have been totally put to bed, because when I look around the room at the rest of the participants, it's been amazing the difference it's made to them. And I sincerely hope that more people who have suffered from strokes get the opportunity to participate in this course.
I would recommend it to anybody. Go and try it, because if it's not for you, stop it, but give it a good try. Do it for 3 weeks and take it in.
I kind of thought, will this do anything for me? And I can honestly say after the 9 weeks, it has just changed me as a person, which I didn't think was possible. So I would recommend that if anyone even had the slightest thought of doing it, give it a try. Just go and give it a try and see what you think, or speak to someone who's done it, because it is absolutely fabulous.
I think I've missed a slide. So what next for Heads Up? As we heard George say, I hope everyone gets the opportunity to try Heads Up. It makes a real difference to people's lives. But what's needed for that is support for a much bigger research study, and for that we need funding. And that's why nights like this are so important. So thank you.